You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Dead Reckoning. This one, Project Riese, the secrets of the Owl Mountains. So let's jump in. Bit of a long one today, so let's go. Excuse me. If you've concluded that your best shot at accumulating vast wealth in life is to wander aimlessly around the countryside with a metal detector, a flask of tomato soup, and a naturally sunny disposition, then the first thing I would advise is to hold off putting the deposit down on that luxury super yacht. Yeah, everyone knows the best shot at accumulating vast wealth is to start a YouTube channel and podcast. I mean, not really. Super yacht would be actually it sounds like a real pain in the ass. Like, it's enough trouble to have to take a car to be serviced. Can you imagine how complicated yachts are? Although I guess if you've got a super yacht, you kind of got people to do that for you, but it's a bit of a headache. But if you're determined to pursue your dreams of striking gold as a detectorist, then you've got to choose a good spot on which to waggle around your funny bleepy stick. This is going to be a key factor in improving your prospects of walking away with a haul containing anything more valuable than a rusty old shed key, half an underwire bra, or a couple of marbles and a pull tab from a can of Dr. Pepper, circa 1972. Also, gold is a non-ferrous metal, right? And do metal detectors work on it being magnetic? I guess they can't possibly, otherwise you'd never be able to detect any gold, would you? You could probably do a lot worse than strutting your detectorist dance moves around the Owl Mountains in southwest Poland. Legends tell of gold buried in them hills. Nazi gold. Maybe a lot more besides. So I guess somehow metal detectors do work on gold, otherwise they'd be a bit useless. The most valuable material that you can find. You might encounter a spot of bother when trying to find it, though, as some treasure hunters in the past have reported unpleasant encounters in which they were gruffly moved along by individuals who appear a bit more aggressive than your average grumpy park attendants. On top of that, there's also a high risk that you might uncover something you really weren't expected to find. Lurking inside and deep beneath the Owl Mountains are the remnants of one of the most mysterious construction projects ever undertaken in history, codenamed Project Riese. The unfinished project, consisting of 7 sprawling subterranean complexes, was first commissioned by Adolf Hitler during the height of the Second World War in 1943. But the exact purposes of the project have never been made entirely clear. I don't know, maybe he just wanted some big old bunker to hide out underground in case it all went wrong. I mean, it didn't exactly work out in the end, did it? Because he was hiding in that bunker in Berlin and then, still popped it. He popped himself off, but only because otherwise he would have got popped off. Excuse me. Speculation runs rife that Project Riese was intended to be a boss-sized bunker, a fancy new headquarters for the Third Reich, or an entire underground city. But it may also have been the site of a grim laboratory in which the Nazis were secretly developing anti-gravity weapons, nuclear bombs, flying saucers, and time machines. I mean, wait, this is heavy duty, Doc. This is great. 2 of these are absurd. I mean, anti-gravity weapons, maybe, possibly someday, but current understanding of science, no way. And then nuclear bombs and flying saucers, definitely things that exist. I mean, flying saucers, not aliens. But like, the military has built flying saucer-shaped stuff in the past. Time machines? Come on. If they had time machines, why wouldn't they use one to come back and redo World War II? And it could well be the spot on the map which marks the rough location of long-lost treasures, including a vanishing Nazi gold train, which is said to have been heaving with quite a few more valuables than you're ever likely to pick up when flinging a metal detector around on the local beach. The intriguing point here is at least some of those wacky theories aren't quite as outlandish as they may first sound. So what kind of secrets could really be hiding in the bowels of the Owl Mountains? And are we ever going to dig up the truth? Or is it destined to remain buried forever? In August 2015, preliminary excavation work got underway near a railway embankment known as Kilometer 65 in the Polish city of, I apologize, I'm going to be butchering most of these names, Polish city of Wałbrzych, around 80 kilometers or 50 miles away from the Owl Mountains Landscape Park. A couple of guys had convinced the government that the legendary Nazi gold train was waiting to be found deep beneath their surface, and they had ground-penetrating radar images to prove it. I feel like I would have definitely heard of this, like giant Nazi gold train being found, so I'm going to guess those penetrating radar images didn't actually prove anything. It may seem like an odd final destination for a locomotive laden with gold, but to understand the logic behind this lust for loot, we naturally have to rewind back to the Second World War, when Adolf Hitler first began to form yet another one of his slightly potty ideas. It was at some point in late 1943 that Adolf Hitler, famous for the Holocaust and possibly having a tiny deformed micropenis, issued the order for construction to begin on Project Riese in the Owl Mountains in Lower Silesia, a region which is recognized as Polish territory today, but back then was considered to be within German borders. The Owl Mountains seemed like an ideal location to start tunneling underneath the earth like little Nazi moles. Covering an area of roughly 200 square kilometers, the tough, often inaccessible terrain is a steep, twisted wilderness where secrets are likely not to be found in a hurry. But it is also described as a picturesque site that offers breathtaking landscape views which can be admired while hiking, biking, or cross-country skiing. But Hitler probably didn't have cross-country skiing on his mind when he first ordered the digging. No, Hitler always just had genocide on his mind. Well, we don't even know the full extent of what he had in mind when he ordered the digging, but judging by the sheer vast scope of the project, it was something a little more serious than a man cave where he could chill out in the evenings and get a bit of peace after a hard day at the office. The actual name of the project might give you a clue, as Riesen is the German word for giant. A total of 7 access points lead into the separate tunnel complexes, which were all expected to be connected together at some point, if the plans had not been somewhat scuppered by various other bothersome events that were unfolding around the world. 6 of those uncompleted complexes are located under the Owl Mountains, while the 7th is located under the castle in nearby northern Wałbrzych. Dating back to 1292, this was formerly one of the most opulent castles in Europe, before it was seized and ransacked by the Nazis in 1944, after the previous noble residents had either fled or signed up for the Polish army. Nazis, ruining it for everyone. Around 990,000 cubic meters of tunnels are known to exist today, stretching out to around 5.5 miles or 9 kilometers in length. That's a lot of space, and I mean, like 5.5 miles in underground tunnels is quite a bit. But it's not what you imagine when you hear 990,000 cubic meters. In venturing down to varying levels between 65 to 165 feet, all this sounds pretty impressive in itself. As we'll discover in a little while, some records suggest the original complexes were way bigger than that. Under normal circumstances, you might have expected a big job like this to cost a pretty packet. But it's not like Hitler had to phone around to find the most competitive quote. No, he was going to use slaves. He already had access to a huge workforce plucked from labor camps and concentration camps who could do this kind of shit for free. After cutting down trees, digging reservoirs, and draining ditches, and creating a new network of roads and bridges to connect the excavation sites to local railway stations, where deliveries of fresh materials could be picked up, the real work got underway. While specialists were brought in to handle the complicated tasks, such as blasting the rocks with explosives and reinforcing the tunnels with concrete and steel, the majority of the digging and manual labor was carried out by thousands of largely Polish, Italian, Czechoslovakian, and Soviet prisoners of war, along with thousands more Jewish prisoners transferred from the Auschwitz concentration camp. And this was clearly no picnic, as the forced laborers were shoved into a humid and dangerous environment and ordered to dig in a rock which has about the same hardness as steel. Excuse me. It's reported that even children as young as 10 were roped into the project, pushing around mining carts or performing other menial tasks. Of course, it's the Nazis. What do you expect? The conditions were as appalling as you'd expect, not helped along by a typhus epidemic which wiped out a large chunk of the workforce in December 1943. Even without the typhus epidemic, the chances of surviving the job appeared to be fairly remote, as the average life expectancy was just 4 months. While the exact figures will never be known, it's estimated that around 13,000 prisoners worked on the project at some point. The lucky ones were those who were deemed too exhausted to continue and were returned to prisoner of war camps and concentration camps. If the lucky outcome of your work detail is to be returned to a concentration camp, you know you're in a shitty place. But around 5,000 of the prisoners are estimated to have died on the job, either from disease, exhaustion, malnutrition, predictable accidents and lethal conditions, abusive treatment from the guards, or execution after a failed escape attempt. There were 14 documented executions linked to escape attempts, but the true figure is likely to be higher. Yeah, if you're gonna die or best case be sent to a concentration camp, you'd be like, yeah, fuck it, take a shot and go. Although considerable progress had been made by April 1944, Hitler still wasn't happy and felt that things needed to be sped up a bit. He perhaps never paused to reflect on how working the half-starved prisoners to death wasn't proving to be very effective as a long-term strategy. By this point, even those in Hitler's inner circle were trying to drop subtle hints to the Fuhrer that the whole idea was completely bloody insane, and that the huge resources getting plowed into Project Riese might be better invested in efforts to turn the tide of the war. You don't say. Project Riese had been originally overseen by the Silesian Industrial Company, which had been freshly formed for this very purpose. But as increasingly impatient Hitler demanded quicker results from dying workers, he took the decision to pass control of the project over to the military engineering outfit, Organization Tat, which was headed by his chief architect and close ally, Albert Speer. Although Albert Speer was unlikely to have dared voice his concerns to Hitler, he did later suggest in his memoirs that he had reservations over how the project was tying up indispensable mining specialists and draining critical resources, noting how it was getting through more concrete than it had been put aside for air raid shelters for the entire population of Germany. I mean, it's Hitler, right? But also, like, what the fuck are you doing, dude? You need this elsewhere. You don't want to build some giant gold bunker in Poland when you don't have enough air raid shelters in Germany proper. Come on, dude, get it together. Meanwhile, Hitler's uh, adjutant, Nicholas von Bellow, was a little braver than Albert Speer, openly uh, criticizing the plans to a stubborn Hitler who would not be swayed. Well, he definitely wants to get shot. It was only after Albert Speer and an organization Todt had taken over the project that the decision was made to extend operations to the castle, which had been seized by the Nazis. The castle had already been stripped bare of its valuable art, ceiling frescoes, mosaic tiling, and elegant furniture, leaving the building little more than an empty husk of centuries of memories. But now, why not just leave it there? You already captured this area, right? So you think it's all just going to go brilliantly? And if it doesn't go brilliantly, well, it's going to be game over anyways, isn't it? So why are you stripping it bare and taking the shit elsewhere? Why not just leave it as a nice castle and give it to like one of the top Nazi pricks? I mean, come on. But now the workmen were moving in to install new elevators, so it wasn't all doom and gloom. Although we can't be sure the exact purpose of Project Riese as a whole, it's generally presumed that these new castle elevators, two words that don't go together very often, would either lead down into a complex that would serve as Hitler's own private bunker, or an entire new headquarters for the Third Reich, or possibly both. It's interesting to note that all the seven separate complexes, the castle complex is considered to be the most complete, even though work didn't start on it until very much later than the others. So it was clearly a pressing priority in the eyes of Adolf Hitler, who may have considered an emergency evacuation route to be of more importance than whatever else was going on in the other complexes. But the problem is, if you have something like this isn't a good strategy to go and hide out in like a giant bunker, because you've enslaved thousands of people to build it, and they're going to talk. And as soon as a concentration camp's liberated, they'll be like, yeah, you might want to check out those mountains in Poland because that's where he is. Assuming that's how it went, excuse me, you've got to just disappear. It seems that the ultimate plan was to eventually connect all seven complexes together to create one giant subterranean labyrinth of tunnels and halls and chambers and laboratories. I don't know, staff break rooms with ping pong tables and water slides. But it turns out that Nicholas von Bellow was bang on with his gut feeling that he'd never see the completion of Project Riese. By early 1945, the Allied forces were closing in on Germany, and the Red Army were heading in the general direction of the Owl Mountains. And it didn't look as if any of them were in the mood for biking, hiking, or cross-country skiing. No, they're in the mood for death. Although work continued on Project Riese up until the dying days of the war, even after the death of Adolf Hitler, the last remaining SS unit eventually fled for their lives as the Soviet forces descended on the Owl Mountains after liberating Poland. After their sudden departure, the Nazis grabbed whatever treasures may or may not have been stashed in the tunnels before booby-trapping all seven complexes and blasting them to rubble, with the intention of making them completely inaccessible to any nosy Parker Allied soldiers or detectorists who might be stumbling around the Owl Mountains in the future. It's not yet clear what happened to the prisoners who were still working on Project Riese at the time, but we can make a grimly calculated guess. They were nowhere to be found when the Soviet soldiers arrived, and no mass graves were located, and it seems unlikely that the fleeing SS unit would have taken the prisoners for a ride. Oh no, they're just in there, aren't they? They left them in the complex and then blew it up. So they're just sealed in there, which is fucked up. But Nazis, not really a surprise. That only leaves us with the most realistic outcome, that the prisoners were herded into the tunnels before the explosives were detonated. Now, if you were to take a wander around the Owl Mountains today, you'd still come across evidence of what the Nazis left behind. The barricaded tunnel openings, fragments of military barracks and bunkers, and piles of excavated matter seem somewhat at odds with the otherwise naturally picturesque setting frequented by hikers, bikers, and cross-country skiers. And despite the best efforts of the fleeing Nazi soldiers to obliterate the evidence, many of the actual complexes can still be seen today thanks to exploration work, which has been carried out over the ensuing decades. Not all of them, though. 3 of the complexes situated in the Owl Mountains. Again, I'm going to butcher these names. Complex Soban, Complex Woderaz, and Complex Jugowitz are still inaccessible and definitely not recommended for picnic spots. Portions of the other 3 are now thriving tourist attractions run by private companies, along with portions of the complex nestled under the castle. The tour guides will lead you through the creaky networks of chambers and halls and guard rooms, while explaining the known history of the location and the plight of thousands of prisoners who lost their lives during the construction. If you're feeling particularly of interest, you might enjoy a visit to complex holders in which some of the tunnels are flooded and can only be accessed via a boat route trip. But the real intriguing point here is not so much the portions of the tunnels that can be visited today, or even the portions that are known about but remain inaccessible to the public. It's the portions of the tunnels that we don't know about. According to his memoirs, Chief Architect Albert Speer estimated that a total of 213,000 cubic meters of tunnels have been carved in the Owl Mountains. As we are currently only aware about 90,000 cubic meters of tunnels, this would indicate that there are a further 123,000 cubic meters which have yet to be discovered. So it could be the case that we've barely scratched the surface of the mystery, and who knows what secrets and treasures could be buried deep within the rock. You always wonder, why haven't they all been fully excavated already? It doesn't sound like it'd be that hard to just go and dig through all the debris and sort it out. And I mean, if you can turn it into a tourist attraction, you can probably even pay for it afterwards. Part of the difficulty in figuring out the full scope of Hitler and Albert Speer were planning is that very little documentation related to the project has survived. Most of the records are believed to have either been destroyed or remarkably well hidden by the Nazis as the Red Army marched onto the Owl Mountains. It's also reported that Polish special services did manage to get their hands on some related documentation, but they rather carelessly lost them without ever divulging what they contained. I mean, sure, but at this point in the war, probably also wasn't their priority to get all the paperwork in order. It might have helped if the Nazis had left behind any equipment or other clues within the tunnels, although it's quite possible that they actually did. After Soviet troops made themselves comfortable for a while near the Owl Mountains, things became a little fuzzy over who was responsible for the state in which the tunnels were left. While it's generally believed that the German soldiers took as much as they could before sealing the tunnels with explosives, the Soviet soldiers could well have looted and barricaded some of the tunnels before they left the scene. The abandoned tunnels were certainly pretty empty by the time most of the region of Lower Silesia, including the Owl Mountains, was handed back to Poland in 1945, following the post-war Potsdam Agreement, which would lead to the almost total expulsion of all previous German citizens from the region by 1949. There wasn't actually that much interest in the tunnels in the years that immediately followed, although it's reported that the Polish government began secretly sniffing around the Owl Mountains during the 40s and 50s after hearing hushed whispers of buried Nazi gold. The wider lack of interest was down to the fact that barely anybody in the world had ever heard of the project until much later on. Only when historians began digging through the very limited evidence and documentation on a quest to uncover the true scale of the operation did Project Riese start making its way back into public consciousness. Yet several decades later, the jury's still out over what exactly might have been going on down in those 7 complexes. One obvious conclusion to reach is that in the face of intensified Allied bombing over Germany in 1943, the Third Reich became quite keen to move underground, where they were a lot less likely to get their arms and legs blown off. And it makes sense to have like a big old government bunker somewhere else. Whether that should be at the cost of air raid shelters and stuff in the main part of Germany, I mean, probably not. But also, it's not a bad idea to do something like this. In that respect, the Owl Mountains would have been a handy spot to safely take cover for a while and play a few card games, simply because of the steel strength of the rock from which the mountains are formed. But the sheer jaw-dropping size of Project Riese suggests that something else was going on. Something that went way beyond any effort to protect Adolf Hitler and a few of his cronies. Is it more than just a bunker? I mean, the British did it. They built like an underground city where like the main parts of government and stuff could hide underground. A project which may have been considered pretty important to the war effort could have been the development of super secret weapon or a Wunderwaffe, which could potentially have tilted the odds back into Germany's favor. According to the relatively recent discovered transcripts taken from the interrogation of SS officers, a mysterious machine nicknamed the Nazi Bell was indeed in development down in the Project Riese tunnels, and depending on how far down the rabbit hole you're willing to travel, this could could have either been a devastating anti-gravity device, which killed many of the scientists working on it, a flying saucer, a time machine, or a really fancy coffee machine, which also dispensed a wide variety of soupy drinks with proper croutons and everything. But, excuse me. We'll return to the Nazi bell in just a little bit. Before that, we should first dive into the theory that really ignited the imaginations of conspiracy theorists, fortune seekers, and lottery ticket purchasers over the years. That somewhere deep within those mountains, there are literally trainloads of lost treasures and Nazi gold. When new Polish settlers arrived in the region in the late 40s, they often found pleasant surprises waiting for them in their new houses. We're not talking about a bottle of wine and a box of Polish biscuits generally left behind by the previous German residents who were getting booted out following the Potsdam Agreement. We're talking about gold and silver and fabulously expensive jewelry, which could be found stashed behind the walls if the new tenants even bothered to check. It would appear that many of the former German homeowners were under the impression that their current situation was only a temporary minor inconvenience and that they would eventually be able to return to their houses and reclaim their hidden valuables at a later date. But that later date never resurfaced, and the land was given back to Poland, leaving many of the new settlers to come across some quite remarkable discoveries when it was time for a spot of interior decorating. Still, it made for a nice welcoming present for the new Polish settlers, and it's a bit of a change from finding an old gas bill under the floorboards or a dead cat in the attic. This kind of thing helped push the notion that gold was leaking out of every corner of Lower Silesia, particularly after a German police officer admitted under interrogation that he played a part in hiding German treasures towards the end of the war. This officer was one of the very few Germans allowed to stay in the region, but he was arrested in 1950 on suspicion of displaying anti-Polish attitudes. During questioning, he claimed that truckloads of personal valuables were taken by the BLM and buried in various secret locations around Lower Silesia, with the hope that they would eventually be retrieved and given back to the owners, perhaps after the Nazis won World War III. So the owners of this gold were surely just looted from Jews and civilians, right? And then the Nazis were like, yeah, we'll have that. We'll redistribute it to these people we're giving houses to. And then they're like, yeah, we're the owners now. However, Herbert kept changing elements of his story, the officer, so we're not sure if his claims are entirely reliable. But the idea still persists that the region is littered with loot, which either rightfully belonged to German citizens or was stolen and hidden by the Nazis during the war. And while the concept of Nazi gold hiding in the Owl Mountains sounds more suited to an Indiana Jones plot than a potentially real-life scenario, it's not quite as far-fetched as it may sound. It's well documented that the Nazis had a nasty habit of plundering as much loot from occupied territories as they could get their grubby little hands on during the war. They even set up special programs dedicated to thieving from museums and palaces and banks. While some of the stolen treasure and precious artwork were rightfully returned to their original owners or descendants, a great deal of it is still unaccounted for. We also know that towards the end of the war, retreating Nazi soldiers adopted a widespread tactic of hiding some of this booty in old mines and underground locations, where it was deemed to be reasonably secure from prying eyes of Allied forces and reasonably well protected from any bombs that might get dropped in the general area. And when it came to choosing the safest and most secure underground location of all in which to hide the lion's share of the loot, you have to concede that those 213,000 cubic meters of tunnel came into the Owl Mountains seem like a pretty promising contender to top the list. One of the most enduring theories related to buried treasure is that the Owl Mountains were the final destination of a locomotive that just appeared to vanish into thin air during the final months of the war. In 19 1945, an armored train is said to have departed from the station at the city we today know as Wrocław, the Polish capital of the Lower Silesian Voivodeship. The train was headed towards the station in Walsbrick, about 40 miles away, but it never arrived. At some point between the two stations, the armored train just went missing in action. This was something a little more serious than a public train service getting canceled due to the wrong type of leaves falling on the track. Before the train set off on its journey from Wrocław, there were alleged sightings of German soldiers loading it up with all manner of gems and jewels and paintings, as well as a rumored 300 imperial tons of gold. I'm not sure what an imperial ton is, but it's quite close to a metric ton, so let's just say 1,000 kilos. Price of gold is what, 60,000 a kilo? Probably more these days, so that's 60 million per ton, and they got 300 tons of it, so that's like what, 18 billion, or is it 1.8 billion? Either way, it's a lot of money. As the Red Army marched even closer to Lower Silesia, it appears the German soldiers were under instructions to take the treasure for a surprising outing. The journey was never intended to follow all the way down the usual rail track leading to Walsbrick. Instead, the train was diverted at some remote spot onto a makeshift temporary track, which led into an old mine or tunnel system, after which the track was removed and the mine or tunnel entrance sealed up. The exact location is up for debate, but one natural theory to emerge from all of this is that the train had a special spot reserved in one of those 7 Project Riese complexes, most probably the one underneath the castle. And it could still be there today, very deep in one of the many undiscovered portions of the sprawling complex. I do kind of believe, we know there are shipwrecks out there with billions of dollars of gold that have just gone missing. And same for these trains and stuff. Some of it's rumored, some of it's not. Some of it's definitely true and it's just missing, so it's somewhere. Again, while the whole idea of a Nazi gold train may sound a little fanciful, the Nazis certainly had form when it came to this kind of thing. Excuse me. In 1945, as the Soviet army advanced on Budapest, Hungary, the order came from the German Supreme Military Command to stuff a load of treasures, largely stolen from Hungarian Jews, onto a 46-car freight train bound for Germany via Austria. The massive haul of valuables included 5 tons of gold, 700 pounds of diamonds and pearls, and thousands of paintings and oriental rugs, at an estimated value of somewhere between 50 and 350 million at the time. Which, after punching the numbers into my calculator, would give me somewhere in the region of 870 million to 6 billion today. Which is way less than the 300-ton gold train, but still absolutely insane. But did the victims get it back? So the Nazis were foiled, and all the Hungarian Jews got their stolen goods back, right? Well, not quite. In fact, no, not at all. The Nazis were certainly foiled, but barely anything went to the rightful owners. The US declared that it was impossible to verify the rightful ownership of all this treasure, so some of it was auctioned off with the proceeds going to the International Refugee Organization. Some of it was given to army exchange stores, and some of the nice pieces of art and furniture somewhat mysteriously popped up later in the homes of high-ranking US Army chiefs, majors, brigadiers, and generals. Even today, we still don't know exactly what happened to over 200 high-value pieces of artwork seized from the Hungarian Nazi gold train. It wasn't until 1999 that a report prepared by the Presidential Advisory Commission on Holocaust Assets in the U.S. revealed the shortcomings in the restitution efforts, leading to an eventual apology to the Hungarian Holocaust survivors from the U.S. government and a settlement in 2005 totaling $25.5 million. Which is still being distributed to Jewish social service organizations today. Only a single Holocaust survivor was present at the mediation. Because it's really, really late. Enter, I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name, Slokowski. The late Polish miner, name I tried to pronounce already, was convinced that the treasure train was hiding somewhere near the Owl Mountains. Before his recent death at the ripe old age of 90, he pretty much devoted the last half of his life, say 45 years, to finding the Nazi gold train. You might even say it was a bit of an obsession. Yeah, he spent half his life doing it. You could say that. I mean, you might. But when he was still a miner working near Walsburg in the 50s, his fluency in the German language helped him strike up several friendships with some of the few German miners who had still been allowed to live in the region, even if they weren't usually treated with much respect from the rest of their Polish colleagues. One of the German miners told him the story of the disappearing train, while another told him about the Project Riese tunnels, which were still not widely known at the time. But it was a third German miner who had become particularly close friends with him after he bravely intervened in a random beating from the Polish lot, who told him a harrowing story which didn't initially seem to be connected to the vanishing train. Towards the end of the war, this miner had been very good friends with a whole family of fellow Germans who were murdered by Nazi soldiers. Now this raises an obvious question: why would Nazi soldiers be murdering German civilians? But many years later, he believed that he had stumbled across the answer. At some point in the 70s, he had a conversation with a former train stoker who witnessed a high-security fence being erected around the train tracks near an embankment known as Kilometer 65 between Wrocław and Walsburg. This was on the very same day that the gold vanished. Curious to find out what was going on behind the fence, the stoker climbed on top of one of the carriages of the train on which he was working, which sounds a bit dangerous if it was moving, and witnessed several other train carriages being pushed into a tunnel by German soldiers. It was only when he later visited Kilometer 65 himself that he was hit by a sudden realization. The embankment was overlooked by a house which once belonged to the very same German family that had been murdered by Nazi soldiers. This led him to conclude that the family had been permanently silenced because they had potentially seen something that they weren't really meant to see. However, he had great difficulty convincing Polish authorities to get out the shovels and start digging around Kilometer 65. He reckoned that in the 70s he put together a few documents outlining his evidence, which he gave to Polish security services, which promptly went and lost them. During later attempts to secure permission to excavate the site, 4 of his dogs were poisoned. Damn. If this is all true and he's dead now, do we have reason to doubt him? I mean, maybe some people just tell stories. But this is actually pretty intense if it's true. After decades of hassling the authorities, he was finally granted permission to dig in 2003. But he claimed he was ordered to stop by the Polish government after just 3 days because they suddenly decided that his work could damage the integrity of the railway line. He was beginning to sense a conspiracy to stop him from digging up the truth and said in his own words, quote, "There is this invisible hand that is always stopping things from happening." But was there really a conspiracy? It's an odd situation because it's reported that the Polish armed forces were instructed to carry out discreet searches for the gold train near the Owl Mountains at various points between the 60s and the 90s. But the government didn't seem to want citizens getting involved with their own private enterprises. And that all finally changed in 2015 when a couple of hobbyists finally managed to triumph where Slawikowski had failed. The pair seemed a little shy at first. They chose to remain anonymous and only made initial public statements via their lawyers and spokespeople. But what statements were they making? The pair, later identified as Polish construction owner Piotr Koper and German geologist Andrzej Richter, announced that they had heard a deathbed confession from a former SS guard who had witnessed the diversion of the Nazi gold train and was able to pinpoint the precise location where it was abandoned underground at Kilometer 65. Not shoved into a tunnel as such, but buried in a big hole. Koper and Richter weren't just relying wholly on the dying words of a miner, though. A pair of keen train spotters had since taken images of the area with a powerful ground penetrating radar system, which appeared to reveal a deep man made shaft containing what they felt looked like the carriages of a train, stretching out to just 100 meters or about 330 feet in length. They found something massive. After the pair had broken their anonymity, Piotr Koper told the New York Times, quote, "We carried out similar examinations in many other locations, but we never encountered anything like this. There is no way these shapes are of natural origin." In the past 70 years, 3 Cold War secret services, the US, the Russian, and the Polish, carried out searches. We succeeded because we are local people. But there was a catch. Part of the reason why the pair chose to initially remain anonymous was because they were trying to thrash out a secret deal with the Polish government before going public. While they later claimed they had no interest in any cargo found on the train and suggested that it may be crammed full of weapons rather than gold, this rather conflicts with what had earlier been going on behind the scenes. Their lawyers had point-blank refused to tell the government the exact location where they had taken the radar images until they had been guaranteed a 10% finder's fee. This seems extremely reasonable and fair. I mean, that's a pretty big slice of the pie for a couple of guys who later claimed to have no interest in the cargo and just really like digging. I mean, people can change their mind. Also, 10% is not that big of a share. That's a perfectly fine finder's fee. If the train was indeed carrying over 300 imperial tons of gold, as many still suspected, the pair would have walked away with well over $1 billion between them. Not everyone was convinced by the radar images. The mayor of Wolfsburg expressed his doubts over the whole thing while trying hard not to come across as too much of a party pooper. But the governor of the Lower Silesian Voivodeship was more blunt in his appeal, saying, quote, "There is no more proof for this alleged discovery than the other claims made over the years. It's impossible to claim that such a find actually exists at the location indicated based on the documents that have been submitted." However, the mayor and the governor clearly couldn't spot a real train if they were standing on platform 8 with a pair of binoculars and a telescope, because Koper and Richter had managed to convince the higher authority anyway, specifically the Polish deputy culture minister Piotr Zikowski. He publicly declared that the radar images he had viewed confirmed a 99% likelihood that the shaft did indeed contain an armored train of around 100 meters in length. That's a bold statement. We don't know what happened with the negotiations over the 10% finder's fee, but some kind of deal must have been struck. Koper and Richter revealed the exact location of the train to the government, and the official go-ahead was given for an initial, non-invasive assessment of the site. Of course, this immediately aroused the attention of a few other interested parties. For starters, the World Jewish Congress got on the phone to the Polish government to make it clear that any retrieved treasure stolen from Jewish victims should be returned to their original owners, or more likely their heirs. In such a scenario, you'd hope the rightful owners wouldn't be left hanging until 2075 for things to get sorted out. The news also led to a media circus descending on Walbrook to report on the upcoming excavation, along with a whole bunch of treasure hunters who eagerly made their way to the city, armed only with metal detectors, flasks of tomato soup, and sunny dispositions. But not everyone was welcome. These amateur foragers didn't exactly meet the approval of the Polish government, but you can't help feeling that the deputy culture minister might not have played this in the smartest way. After all, he had just excitedly announced that there was a 99% chance that a gold train containing billions of dollars worth of treasure was buried under the earth at kilometer 65. And now he was making an unconvincing suggestion that it would be a bad idea for anyone to try looking for it. He said, quote, "There's billions of dollars in those woods. Don't go looking for them, okay? Trust me, you just don't." In the end, the entire area was cordoned off from the public, and any budding detectorists were given short shrift from the military. The official line from the Polish government was that the move had been taken purely to protect civilians. as there was a good chance that the Nazis had booby-trapped the train or that it might contain dangerous materials. I mean, that's fair. Also, it's the government land, right? It's theirs. They can do whatever they want with it. Still, I'm not sure if the risk of losing a limb or two would have deterred every detectorist from searching for billions of dollars worth of treasure. But they weren't going to get past the military with those flasks of tomato soup. And even while spelling out the dangers, Deputy Culture Minister Pyotr Zakowski again took the curious step of reiterating his absolute certainty that the train existed. This only served to heighten the gold fever that was gripping the city. Perhaps he was secretly hoping that some blundering idiot would set off the booby traps before his guys got on the scene to pick up the loot. Excuse me. After the military had finished clearing trees and vegetation from the site, checking for booby traps and sweeping for mines, the initial non-invasive assessment of the site got underway. This was, this was carried out by a team led by Coper and Richter, alongside another expert team of geologists and mining specialists, led by a professor from the AGH University of Science and Technology in Krakow. However, the two teams appeared to reach very different conclusions. While Coper and Richter felt that there were grounds to push on with the excavation, the specialists, who we knew what they were talking about, concluded that while they may have found evidence of a collapsed tunnel, there was no evidence whatsoever of a train down there. The government completely lost interest in the project following the findings of the professor, but Coper and Richter were determined to carry on alone. With the Polish government backing out after the experts gave a thumbs down, Piotr Koper and Andrei Richter decided they weren't going to give up. Instead, they launched a privately funded excavation in August 2016, nearly a year after the gold train hysteria had first swept the globe. This time, they were paying for everything out of their own pockets, a final push to prove the world wrong and uncover the lost Nazi gold train. They brought in machines, crew, and camera crews too. After all, this was the sort of thing that, if successful, would go down in history. You can imagine the mood, anticipation, excitement, and probably a bit of desperation too. They had put everything into this. But as the days wore on and the digging went deeper, that excitement started to drain away. By the time they dug down to the depths indicated in their original radar scans, they were staring at nothing more than solid rock. No train, no tunnels, no gold, no treasure. No trace of anything man-made at all. Eventually, the team concluded that the anomalies in their radar data were caused by nothing more than natural geological formations. In other words, the ground was just shaped weird. They'd mistaken slabs of rock and voids in the soil for what they thought was a buried armored train. To rub salt in the wound, the total cost of the dig came to around $131,000, money that the two had to cover themselves. That's a hell of a price to pay for a hole in the ground and a global oops. The media that had once swarmed Walsbrick largely vanished once it became clear there would be no glittering treasure chest unearthed from the hillside. Critics quickly began labeling the whole thing a hoax, and some accused Coper and Richter of staging the entire affair to attract publicity or profit from book deals, tourism, or film rights. But there's no real evidence they were being dishonest. If anything, the two men came across more like over-enthusiastic amateurs who genuinely believed they'd found something extraordinary and just wanted to see it through. And to be fair, I mean, if I found something on a radar that I thought looked like a train and the whole world's watching and saying I'm probably wrong, yeah, I'd want to see it through too. In the end, Coper and Richter's story became something of a cautionary tale about hype, about chasing legends, and about how quickly the world can go from cheering your discovery to mocking your mistake. But even after the failed dig, Coper maintained his belief that something was down there, insisting that the job had ended too early and that the train might still be just a few meters deeper. He wasn't ready to admit total defeat. Not yet. So where are we now? Today, no train has been found, no treasure unearthed, and no time machines wheeled out of the ground under the castle. But the mystery of Project Riese remains as tantalizing and frustrating as ever. Despite the failed digs, many historians and treasure hunters alike still believe that vast portions of the tunnel system remain unexplored or deliberately hidden, and the secrets, whether political, technological, or financial, may still lie buried beneath the Owl Mountains. And there are plenty of people still willing to spend the rest of their lives trying to find them. As for the Nazi bell, it's worth circling back just one last time. The idea was popularized largely by Polish journalist Igor Witkowski, who claimed in 2000 that he had accessed transcripts from a classified Polish government interview with a former SS officer. According to those transcripts, which were never verified, the SS officer described a top secret Nazi experiment at a site only known as Der Riese, involving a bell-shaped machine that levitated, glowed, and killed test subjects when activated. The machine reportedly used a strange red liquid called Xerium 525 and required huge amounts of electrical energy. When running, it allegedly created a gravity-altering field that was being researched for advanced propulsion or possibly even time manipulation. Well, that sounds credible. So is any of it true? The vast majority of historians and physicists agree that Die Glocke is most likely fictional nonsense, a modern myth cooked up from Cold War paranoia, SS mystique, and sci-fi flavored conspiracy theories. There's no photographic evidence, no physical remnants, and the only documentation is hearsay based on transcripts that have never surfaced. Still, the concept became catnip for shows like Ancient Aliens, various Discovery Channel specials, and YouTube rabbit holes too deep to measure. And honestly, as far as conspiracy theories go, it's one of the more entertaining ones. But the line between fact and fiction in the case of Project Riese is unusually thin. And that's why it continues to captivate imaginations all over the world. We know the Nazis carved out massive underground tunnels for some secret purpose. We know they spent an astronomical amount of concrete, steel, and manpower to build something on a truly unprecedented scale. We know there was desperation in the final years of the war. We know about lost gold, stolen art, disappearing trains, and plans for last resort bunkers. And we know they tried very hard to hide it all. So even if Die Glocke was just a steampunk fever dream, and even if the gold was nothing but wishful thinking, there's still something real under those mountains. And someone someday might finally find out what the hell it was. And there we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here for this one. It's a crazy story. Even if it ends in mystery, it's the kind of mystery that makes this show what it is. If you like this kind of deep dive mystery and dark history, don't forget to leave a review on the podcast or subscribe on YouTube, whatever platform you're on. And if you want to support the channel, you can buy us a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Larry M. Lease. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening, and I will see you next time.